So, good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. We're now going to go on to our next presentation by Dr. Seán Ó'Riordáin. Unfortunately, Dr. O'Riordan can't be with us this afternoon, but it does give me great pleasure again to introduce him. He's a public consultant, management consultant, and Seán has a rich and broad experience in local governments and public affairs. So please allow me to introduce Dr. Seán Ó'Riordáin. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Hopefully the technology will work. First of all, I should welcome you all to Malahide, which, as you may gather from my voice, I'm actually getting over a dose of COVID and I'm following public health guidelines, so I can't unfortunately be with you today. So let me start. Hopefully my screen will work. Yep, okay. And can I just confirm that the screen is changing? Could somebody just confirm that for me?
That's good, Seán, thank you.
Yeah, okay, Jim, thanks very much. Okay, so just to kick off and following on what I have to say were really excellent presentations over the course of this morning and right up to and including Dermot's presentation, which, you know, clearly indicates the sort of challenges that are going to confront you as an assembly over the next couple of months. Hopefully what I'll do is give you just a broad sense of what's happening in some of the major comparators that we might look at as examples, and indeed others. And that should hopefully lead into a reasonably succinct introduction to some of the presentations that are coming from the individual mayors that are speaking later on this afternoon. Now, you know, why do we compare systems of local government? And something that I'm doing on a reasonably regular basis. Indeed, some of the methodologies that Dermot suggested are ones that I would be very, very familiar with. And it's simply to allow us to try and get a sense of what alternatives are out there for us when we look at the reform of local government, whether it's here in Europe or indeed in the States or in Australia and elsewhere. Are there things that work out in these different parts of the world that might work potentially back in Ireland or France or wherever? Are there in particular mistakes that could be made or have been made that we should try and actively avoid? And again, I think Dermot's really excellent presentation highlights the need to avoid mistakes because of the investment that's required politically and economically to refocus the role of not just local government, but in fact the entire public service. And if that's gotten wrong, it can be very, very expensive. It also allows us to benchmark ourselves. And again, Dermot really highlighted this, the extent to which Ireland would be considered, frankly, a laggard when it comes to local democracy and to systems of government and critical public administration at local level. Now, having said that, you know, one has to be reasonably cautious at the same time because a lot of dimensions make up the background to why it is we have a particular type of local government system or a particular type of public service and a national political system. And I'll touch in on that. And sometimes it is a bit like trying to compare apples and oranges. They may not necessarily be the same. Just to be conscious of that. That said, let's have a look at it. Broadly speaking, right across the globe, pretty much every major city region is confronted with huge challenges coming through from urbanization. And consequently, and again has been pointed out several times over the course of the day, the idea of directly elected mayors or directly elected executive leaders taking control and advancing change in terms of how services are delivered is now a norm right across the OECD. The outlier in some respects in that regard has been, until recently with the advent of Limerick, has been that of Ireland. And hopefully a key impetus to change will come true from the work of yourselves in particular. A key core role for these new types of mayors, and we'll see examples of them later on today, coming from different systems, but very often with the broad same perspective on their role and the change that they underpin, is that mayors provide a platform through which delivering effective public services that are person-centered are best delivered. And again, as Dermot pointed out, we are absolutely unique in our understanding of where services should be best delivered in Irish public management historically. Now, in fairness, that is beginning to change, but it is going to be probably a long roll to roll back some of the changes that have been made historically. But certainly, when we look at most effective delivery platforms for public services that are person-centered, they are generally through urban councils, rural councils, wrapped around a democratically accountable elected chief executive or a chief mayor that's supported by a body of professional administration and technical staffs. So there's no question at this point, but that these are probably the best way to go in terms of reforming our public services. That, however, means very significant changes for how we organise our national public services. And again, I know people have been talking a lot about Ireland being centralised and so on. In fact, it is a unique model in its own right, in that it's not necessarily that it's centralised, but it is very disaggregated. We've lots of silos across different elements of public administration at the national level, which, as Darren pointed out, are being replicated at the local level. In most other European countries in particular, there is a recognition that having a democratically accountable shared service platform called a local authority is a critical platform through which services can be met, but also through which services can be funded, including through the raising of local resources. Again, something I'll just highlight slightly and quickly as we go through the individual examples. But there's no getting away from it. Every major city region across the globe, whether it's down in Auckland or across mainland Europe over to the States, every major urban setting is under severe pressure across a range of areas, some of which are relating to, trying to move towards greater, more sustainable models of development, some of which are about trying to, if you like, manage the relationship that takes place and is naturally going to be a consequence of creating mayoral models that have to interact with central government. Now, some models actually place a very substantive position of the mayor, excuse me, at the national level, and we see that, for example, in places like France. Others are slightly less in tune. And I was reminded of when New Zealand was hosting the Rugby World Cup, the then mayor of Auckland was expressly excluded from the organising committee, even though it was going to be the whole city for the actual final, because the then Prime Minister was of a different party and didn't want the mayor to be getting all the credit. So these things do happen, and sometimes they can be quite flippant, but more often than not, we are now in a space, particularly in Northern Europe, where there are mechanisms in place that provide us with good working examples of how to manage what can be a healthy tension. And again, I'll touch in on some of those over the course of the next few minutes. Critical, I think, in broad terms to any model that might be rolled out is that there's a clear understanding of responsibilities. And again, it was really interesting to listen to the mayors this morning. I would suggest listening to them very carefully in terms of what they said, because what they were saying was absolutely nail on the head. Issues of responsibilities, the capacity to intervene, the capacity to have access to resources to advance delivery of better, more efficient, more effective person-centered services at local level. And how is that to be done against the background of political systems, which in the Irish case, a lot of what goes on in political context in Ireland at national level is actually very driven by local issues and concerns. And again, Mayor McCarthy pointed this out in regard to the sort of circulars and letters that we get from our members of parliament, or TDs and senators, who invariably will announce things like parks and whatever else because it's the good news. And that's what gets people elected, rather than, as she pointed out, highlighting changes that might have come through in policy terms that might be for the long-term betterment of the particular community concerned at the national level. So these things are real challenges that are confronting and will be confronted by any model that's going to be put forward for Dublin. And indeed, as Dermot has pointed out, are a key issue in understanding where Limerick is going to go over the next number of years, notwithstanding the excellent work that's been done by the advisory committee. So we do have these different models. And coming back to, it was interesting, a number of people made this point this morning. If we take Paris as an initial starting point, okay, City Paris itself has a population of 2.7 million people. Population is actually falling. But in the wider Paris metropole, we're looking at a population of 14 odd million people. Within Paris itself, there are a number of mayors who are representative of the arrondissement, which are essentially area councils within the Paris city region. And those councils then nominate representatives to sit on the City of Paris Council, which by the way is bigger than Dáil Éireann, and they then in turn nominate the Mayor of Paris. So Anne Hidalgo is the Mayor of Paris at the moment, but she's one of 21 mayors within the city region that is Paris, because each of the arrondissements would have their own mayor and their own councils responsible for immediate service delivery that are person-centered. So a person that we should all be trying to get to know is the person beside the Mayor of Paris, who is the Mayor of Saint-Denis, which is of course where Stade de France is based. And he and his colleagues from the various arrondissements work closely through the overarching coordinating role that Anne Hidalgo plays at the City of Paris citywide level. It's also worth noting that, and I think this is quite an important point to just keep in mind as well, across most of what you might describe as the successful city regions of the globe, there is an increasing effort politically to try and directly engage with the citizens of the city. And Paris has been an outstanding example of this. They've set it up, the Citizens Assembly, which has statutory responsibilities made up of citizens who would guide and advise on legislation and on advancing initiatives directly to the Mayor of Paris. So in addition to having the 170 odd members of the Council of Paris, she also has access directly to citizens to hear their views in regard to changes that may or may not be required. So it's certainly well worth looking at and keeping in context, because we see similar types of initiatives, and I'm sure mayors this afternoon may well mention them. We see similar types of initiatives occurring in other cities. If we just jump across the pond to the United States, and Boston has been referenced many times. You know, is Ireland closer to Berlin than to Boston? In fact, the city of Boston itself is quite similar in size to Dublin City. It has relatively limited but important functions under the leadership of Michel Wu. And around the city then, there's a wrap of essentially 100 city authorities in Greater Boston, with a population broadly similar to that of Ireland, to the Republic of Ireland, who look at strategic plannings and look at the long-term strategic transport needs of the wider region because of the relationship. And this is, in a sense, not dissimilar in some ways to what happens in Dublin, where you have, as highlighted again by the mayors this morning, the regional assembly taking on the role of setting broad strategic intent for regional economic and spatial development, but the immediacy of service delivery then occurring through the individual local authorities. But what is interesting there is that if you go back into Paris and compare and contrast the numbers of councillors that are in Paris with the number of councillors in Boston as a city. So Boston City has 13 councillors, but they do take on very, very clear leadership roles within that context and are compensated accordingly. Another example that you're going to hear a lot about today would be that of Manchester. And the question about Manchester is, again, who's the mayor? So we have Andy Burnham, who in some respects may also be seen as the effective leader of the political opposition nationally within England in regard to the relationship with Whitehall, Boris Johnson and the Conservative government. And I think it's fair to say he's been a real stone in the shoe of government in England for the Conservative government over the last number of years. And Andy is directly elected by the people of Greater Manchester, which itself became an authority which grew out of an organic growth of strategic relationships. Again, it was interesting, the sorts of things that the mayors mentioned this morning about meeting together regularly and talking together regularly and getting the councils to cooperate regularly. Manchester grew out of that process several years back and got to a point where it became a political necessity to create a political structure that would allow the people of Greater Manchester to vote for responsibilities that would be delegated back out of Whitehall in particular, back into the combined authority structure headed up by Andy. But as Andy plays the role of mayor, alongside him are 10 authorities that continue, like in London, to exist within Manchester, and indeed below the 10 authorities of say, Manchester City Council and so on, Bury and so on, are indeed community councils, which are not unlike the town council structures which existed in Ireland before the 2014 reforms, which Philip Byrne would have mentioned this morning. Now, interesting enough with Manchester, and again, I'd be interested to hear what Andy is saying about this, because he's certainly been in the firing line in terms of the relationship with Whitehall. There has been a migration of what were traditionally centralised services from Whitehall back into Manchester as part of the role that Andy and his team play. But I think it's probably arguable it's been done in some respects to the disadvantage of the overall structure, because it has provided an opportunity for Whitehall to reduce levels of subsidy on critical services that are provided by the authority and indeed by the local authorities within the authority's area. With the result that local government in England generally has been very, very severely, far more severely impacted, frankly speaking, than indeed the local authority structures in Ireland, which, as Philip pointed out this morning, were very severely impacted by austerity. But by comparison with what mayors and their colleagues across the combined authorities of Liverpool and so on in Northern England in particular, they are really, really put to the pin of their collar to meet their obligations in the delivery of social care and education and so on, because of an ageing population and other factors. Meanwhile, Whitehall is taking the benefit of reduced budgets to support them. That said, there is now a levelling up process in place, which was announced a few months back with great authority to underpin the city deals that have been put in place by government departments in Whitehall with the various mayors. What is interesting there is that when you look at the city deal framework and the amount of money behind them, by comparison with the amount of money which is envisaged for spending through local government in Ireland under the National Development Plan, the actual cash money that has been spent or planned to be spent in Ireland is far, far greater, in fact, than the so-called levelling up funds that are going to be made available. And again, it'll be interesting to hear what Andy might say about that. So that's why I do urge caution sometimes to just stand back and look closely at the detail of what is going on around us in local government reforms in other parts of the world, because sometimes you have to be careful what you look for. Helsinki, again, is another interesting model, which is, Helsinki City Council, again, is broadly similar to Dublin City Council. The region of Greater Helsinki is very like Greater Dublin in the sense that you have places like Espoo and so on, which would have broadly similar populations to Fingal's and South Dublin's Dunleary Rathsdowns of the world. And even below those, not unlike what you have in Manchester, you have town or commune authorities that still retain a level of significant independence. But the city of Helsinki itself elects 85 councillors every year. And that's the picture there. And again, it was interesting to hear some of the mayors talking about this morning, the idea, if you like, of mini cabinets running the structure in the local authority context. And this structure is replicated across much of Europe, as Diarmuid has pointed out. And I was delighted that he highlighted Germany. There's a great story about an Irish Taoiseach, a German chancellor and a French president that should be told sometime in terms of their views on local government. But Diarmuid certainly highlighted the importance that local government and the structures that are similar in Nordic Europe to much of now Germany, federal Germany, in terms of the responsibilities, the leading responsibilities that fall to the local authorities. Philip mentioned this morning that the Dublin City Council spends about $1 billion a year, which sounds like a lot of money, but by comparison, Helsinki City Council, which is the same size of population broadly, spends about $5 billion a year, plus $1 billion on top of that in terms of capital investment, in broad terms. And that is led by a group of elected representatives, supported by a chief exec and a team. And that's just to give you a sense of the sort of structure that you're looking at. It's a broadly similar structure to what you'll find pretty much across Nordic Europe into places like Germany and so on. And what is really significant about that is that social or person-related services are the responsibility of the local authority. Hence, for example, the level of spending that the local government does in Ireland relative to the level of spending that has been done in Finland. So again, it provides us with an interesting model. The members, the mayor and the deputy mayors are chosen from among the body of the elected councillors. And again, there's a similar regional structure that does regional sort of planning to what has been done in Dublin. The difference is that the scale of their responsibilities, there's, you know, that when public service looks at the reconfiguration of and reform of delivery of services to the citizen in Finland, and indeed across much of Europe, they focus on the person-centered services as being the primary responsibility for the local authority. And therefore, that's where much of their focus will be. Whereas in Ireland, I suspect if you looked at Dublin City, its spending, there's $1 billion on day-to-day spending, but there's probably the guts of $1 billion, I would imagine, not far off it, on spending in capital infrastructure on an annual basis. So, as I say, quite a different approach. To conclude, and I'll be happy to take questions in a little bit more detail once we finished, but there are many, many different types of mayors. Some are powerful, others are less so. And again, Dermot has really exposed that very clearly. Many do have executive functions, but many others just depend on a powerful pulpit role. They went after the fall of Franco in Spain and the re-establishment of local government, a bit like what happened in Germany, the re-establishment of regional structures like Catalonia and so on, and underneath those were cities like Barcelona. Pierre Maragall became the mayor of Barcelona, and he had very, very limited responsibility, just like Ken Livingstone would have had very, very limited responsibility when he first went in as mayor in London. But they used the pulpit basically to bully the regional or national authorities to push more power. Mayor Daley in Chicago, again, a great example of where that happened. The problem with bullying, and I use the term advisedly, cajoling, aligning, convincing, lobbying, whatever way you want to describe it, other national politicians in particular, to hand back powers is a very, very great challenge, but it has been successfully done in other countries. They haven't had to do it to the same extent in Nordic and Northern Europe generally, but certainly in some of the examples that we look at across the globe. Some models do, and again, it was interesting to hear this coming forward from questions this morning, but if you just got rid of the 4 authorities and had the 1 authority, being frank with you, that has not been such a successful model where it has been attempted. And in fact, as Dermot pointed out, Auckland effectively rolled back quite a bit from the single authority structure to have a lot of local structures, simply because of the need to ensure local voices being represented and having a capacity to input in how government is run within Auckland. And indeed, when a similar type structure was proposed for Perth, it was dropped. And indeed, Melbourne successfully did away with any efforts to have the restructuring of authorities around Melbourne City Council, which is, this Melbourne City itself is about the same size as Cork City, but they have a lot of authorities like Helsinki around them. So, you know, we need to just be alert to these factors as we think in terms of the ideal model for Dublin. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail maybe tomorrow. A key issue that is absolutely central to what works is, and this is a really strong recommendations come through from the implementation committee in Limerick, but is a norm found across pretty much all successful models of mayoral government, whatever type you might be talking about, is having agreement between the mayors, the relevant councils, the regional or indeed the national structures. And you find that in the Nordic countries and mainland Europe generally, even across to the States and so on. It's absolutely critical. And I suspect it would be absolutely critical here in Ireland as well. Political experience is important, but it's not essential. Leadership and communication skills are absolutely critical, perhaps going back to some of the points that were made this morning. And alongside that, having platforms for citizens of Dublin to engage with the mayor would be a strong recommendation from my experience of working with local government systems across the globe. Absolutely essential. I'll finish there, Jim, because I'm conscious of running over time and people may have questions that I'm happy to take.
Dr. O'Riordan, thank you very much. That was so informative.